he warned the early church to get ready for the end of the old system. And he gave them signs, Matthew 24. These are the signs that you're going to see these things happening, and they're going to increase in happening. So that was a sign saying, well, things are getting near the end. But then it was like, when you see this happen, then you need to leave, because this is the end. And therefore, don't stay in Jerusalem a second longer than you have to. You need to get out, because when you see, and in Matthew and in Luke, it says different things which refer to the same thing. When you see armies surrounding Jerusalem or coming to surround Jerusalem, or when you see the abomination of desolation in the temple, which was, harping back to different things that had happened in the past in history, in which there was a pig sacrificed in the temple by a particular guy in the past. I think he was called something Epiphanes, I think. Now, this was a sign that essentially there would be a desecration of the temple or the end of the temple. So leave. Now, I think what systems might change today that God may be giving us signs of and things to prepare for and warnings to say, when you see this, you need to leave or get ready for change. And an example would that be maybe the financial system. We all operate in the financial system because most people would struggle, unless they're living off grid completely, to not operate in some way in the financial system. Most of us pay for things with money that we've got in the bank, or money that we're using electronically that eventually we will pay for, that we've got in the bank or somewhere else. Most people don't pay for things in cash. And certainly, if I was to buy something off Amazon, they wouldn't accept an envelope full of cash. So, well, we're in the system. But what would happen if that system collapsed? Where would our money and assets and value go? Would we lose it? Would we be able to get access to it? What happens if there was the electronic crash? What happens if the system crashes? Well, I think God was warning people to start looking at how you're getting ready for how things might be different in the future. Therefore, look at that and be prepared, both in your thinking, in that I need to think now in how would I live in a different form of life. And that also goes to the same thing of, well, if I'm going to live forever and there's no, death, and there's going to be an immortal sense of life, well, how am I going to live in the next 100 years or 200 years? Do I have enough money in the bank? Probably not, if I'm going to live and not die. So how am I going to live? Am I not going to function with money? Well, probably not in the way that I am now. And, therefore, how do I transition from where I am now, continue living with all that I need and everything I need for outworking God's purpose in my life? So I'm also thinking about that in financial terms. It's like, can I be looking at having enough money to live for another 300 years, managing the bills as I would now? Well, probably not in the way that we see money, but God's provision is going to be there. So how is his provision going to be there? And what preparation do we need to be living in his provision rather than in the system we're living in now? So, if God is going to give signs of the end of the old, then there's also this is how you live in the new. And you can look at that in many different ways, of end of a whole world system, ends of different aspects of how people are living today, but also the end of in their own life of things, living differently and having change take place. So I think, let's say the financial system, you've got all sorts of conspiracy stuff around the financial system, and you've got a lot of this stuff. Oh, there's going to be debt cancellation, and Nasara and Gasara and all of that. And to be honest, that's not the answer. Yeah. and there's all this stuff like, well, there's going to be a supernatural transfer of wealth. And I do believe ultimately God is going to enable us to live with a wealth mentality and attitude, but that's not necessarily to do with money. It's to do with how we live in a sense of well-being, and I have all that I need. And therefore, what's going to happen? Well, let's hypothesize that the financial system as it stands now may collapse. And God is going to warn his people to get ready for that, and to be specifically ready to get all their money out before it collapses. So what we're going to do, we take all the money out in cash. Well, how are we going to do that? You have to think about that in advance. You can't just walk down to the bank if the bank is closed. How are you going to do it in advance? If you've got money in pension pots, if you've got money in investments, how are you going to realize those assets to receive those assets so you don't lose them in a financial crash? And I think we need to think and ask God for the wisdom and strategy of how to do that. And I think with Enoch and others can helping us begin to see where we are and to be ready to walk with God in a different way and get ready for what's going to take place. And ultimately, let's say we withdrew all our cash. Well, if you got it in hard cash or bearer bonds or whatever form of something, you have to be able to cash that in. Well, if there's no money and there's no financial system, how are you going to cash it in? So God may well give us insight into put our assets into something that are tangible. Could be gold. And I know years ago, John Paul Jackson told people, if you've got investments, put them into gold, because essentially gold keeps its value. If you took all your cash out and stuck all your cash under your mattress and, oh, well, I'm going to live off the cash from now on, it's going to devalue. Gold doesn't devalue. Also, land doesn't devalue. And actually, if we're going to establish heaven on earth and embassies of heaven and restoration cities, where are we going to build them? Even if we don't even have to build them, but we can create them, we have to have somewhere to put them. You know, a city of 1 million people, you can't put that in a field in your backyard. So you have to maybe invest in large swathes of land together, perhaps. So you buy up contiguous land so that you have a whole mass of land ready for when we start to establish heaven on earth in that way. So I think there's sort of things we have to think about and get ready for and have the strategy for when we see the signs leading up to and when this is the sign. And it's no good in this instance saying, right, get out now, when it's the middle of the night and you can't even access the bank or you can't draw the money out. How you get it? So we've got to be ready and have the right strategies. And people say, oh, cryptocurrency is the thing. Cryptocurrency is no safer than any other currency, other than you may not be able to trace transactions. But then if you've got no problem with what you're spending stuff on, why would that be a problem? Other than conspiracy, I don't want the government to know where my money is, you know, and all that type of stuff, which is just, you know, nonsense. But the cryptocurrency is all electronic and basically based on nothing, and non-fungible tokens and all the other nonsense out there that certain people are pushing is like waste of time. Because if there was no electronic ability to access something, you can't access it and you can't get it out. So we got to look at different ways. And I look back and I think, what has God shown me and prepared me to think about? And in the past, I found people were giving me gold and silver. I didn't ask for gold and silver. And to be honest, all the gold and silver just sits in a drawer. Well, it sits in the drawer in my office. Yeah. And I'm like, okay, well, what am I going to do with it? I don't know. You know, well, it just sits there. But what it did is it stimulated me to think, why would God encourage people to give me silver and gold? And it wasn't like, big ingots of it. You know, there was a pot of silver and various little, ounces of gold and this sort of thing. But it caused me to think there's a reason for that. And I need to think about actually what are tangible assets and how would that help me in the future? Now, I don't know if I had a big pot of gold or I put everything into ingots of gold, it wouldn't help me go down the supermarket and buy my food, would it? So I'm not sure in the short term. Well, how would that help me manage every day? Well, I've got hard currency assets of effectively gold as an asset. Would that give me stuff that I could say, well, I've got this asset. Will you give me this? And then this will be what we'll be paying for it in the future. I don't know. And some of these things are the things we have to think about of how then we would manage. Because if I put all my assets into land, well, that must produce something. Otherwise, well, what am I going to use? So the currency that we use in money, which is based in sort of paper, I promise to pay the bearer of this note a certain amount. Well, with what? More money? Well, that doesn't really work. So no, with something more solid. So we have to think about managing the future, being ready for managing the future, the transition out of an old system into a new one, in which if there was no money per se or electronic money, how would you live in the interim of not being able to go back down the supermarket? Because essentially, if the whole thing collapsed and people couldn't buy food, what would they do? Well, a lot of people would go and loot the food and they would go and take, and yes, at the end of the day, the police couldn't stop them, could they? If a million people suddenly decided they were going to go and take the food out of the supermarkets, it would be hard to stop them. Now, obviously, I don't believe God wants that sort of chaos or anarchy or that revolutionary type thing. So we have to look at how we manage transition and the future and be ready for whatever it is that's going to happen. If you enjoy these videos, would you please take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe? It really does help. Thank you very much.